Hi everyone, welcome back for another training session. We're going to start slow just to give everybody a chance to join for the next couple of minutes. Welcome, welcome. Good. Just before we start, again, if anybody's not on the mailing list, so there's a mailing list with reminders and links to these training sessions. If you want to join the mailing list to get an email every week with a link to join and the link to previous sessions, just let me know. Just ask in the chat and I'll pop the link in there. There's also a WhatsApp group for the training, so if you've gotten any Lightroom related or any editing or workflow related questions, you're welcome to ask them through the week as well in the WhatsApp chat. If you need that link, you can also ask me if you're not in the group already. Good, I see more people join. So we're going to give it a slow start just to every week there's a couple of people joining like a minute or a couple of minutes late, so we'll just start slowly and get into the session for today. Today we're looking at some of the latest features in Lightroom, in the new Lightroom. These include the new way of doing masking. So previously the Lightroom or Lightroom Mobile had masking, but they've improved it a lot in the last couple of months. So it works a bit differently, but it's a lot more powerful now. It's a really good feature now in Lightroom. The masking, local editing, and also the artificial intelligence that they've now built into this section, into the masking section, is really good. It saves a lot of time when doing editing. So yeah, it's really exciting, and it's amazing where Lightroom is headed. I'm expecting the artificial intelligence to be a focus for Lightroom going forward, and in the next updates I'm sure we'll see even better. I'm softer than usual, sorry. Let me put my volume a little bit up. Ryan, let me know if that's better. Okay, so yeah, just let me know if the sound's better now. I can adjust it more if needs be. But yeah, the Lightroom's masking and the artificial intelligence that they've now connected to the masking, and the new way, okay, great stuff. The new way that Lightroom actually does masking and handles masking, where you can now do multiple masks connected together to either subtract or add to masks, is really nice. If you've been using Lightroom and the new Lightroom especially for quite some time, you'll remember we basically had linear gradients, we had the paint tool to do masking, and we also had radial gradients, so round or oval shaped gradients, linear gradients, which were just like going in a line from full mask and then fading out, so we could do just linear gradients, and then we could also paint in some masks. Now they've combined all of this, and they've included some artificial intelligence into this masking tool section that we've got in Lightroom. So it's really exciting, and we can now for the first time also combine different masking tools to get specific masks that we want. And this opens up a lot of possibilities for local editing that previously, like many of the other new tools in Lightroom, is actually stuff that we used to, we had to go to a tool like Photoshop to do a lot of this. Now we can do it all within Lightroom, and a lot quicker, and also apply it to multiple images if we wanted to. So it's really exciting where Lightroom is headed with this local editing tools that they're giving us. Okay. A few people joined, a few more joined. Okay, that's all good. I think we'll just head on over and start in Lightroom, and I'll show you what the masking tools looks like now. These are, to me, some of the most exciting things happening in Lightroom. As I said, they're saving me a lot of time, and they're saving some images that might have otherwise not been amazing images that I can actually now rescue with some local editing and artificial intelligence. So let's look at my iPad. I'm editing on the iPad, but again, like previous weeks, these tools you'll find in all the versions of Lightroom, also even in Classic, if you know where to find all these things. but Lightroom Mobile, so on your phone, on your tablet, the online version of it, so the one you can run in your browser, or the new Lightroom if you install the new normal Lightroom, the cloud version on your laptop or Mac, they will all work the same. Okay, let's look at a couple of images here. Some of these images we've seen before, but we edited them in a different way. Today we're going to be using these local edits to edit these images, and I've also got a couple of new images, and specifically things like landscapes where you want to edit the sky separately from the rest of the image. That's a really useful place to use these tools. And portraits as well. They work really well on local editing, works really well on portraits. So let's hop in and just do some examples to get to know these tools. So this is our first image. I think this was one where Mark from Joburg Photowalkers was with me. Reef Hotel, I think, on the roof, if I remember this one correctly. That's the view from there. Quite a nice view. We had some nice clouds. We had a storm rolling in from sort of behind us from the south. This is looking more northeast from the Reef Hotel. And let's start with the tools. Sorry. I just need to switch on my gestures so you can see where I'm touching. That's better. Okay, so now we've got the little red dot. Right there where I've got the red dot, that's our masking tools. So they sit right between the healing tools and there at the bottom where we can do copying of settings and our versions. This little round dot, you'll see it right next to the red dot. So there's a round dot, and that's our masking tools. So all the new masking tools, including the new artificial intelligence masking, sits right there. So I'm going to click on that. So normally I would start by doing global edits and adjusting the whole image first, and then as I get to sort of the end of my edits, I might make more local adjustments. But in this case, to showcase what these tools can do, we're just going to start straight off with masking, see what we can do with this image. The very first thing I'm going to be doing is look at that sky and maybe adjust the sky a tiny bit. So we're going to, right here, you'll see there's a new plus button there. So this is new in one of the newer updates of Lightroom. Previously, we just, as soon as we pressed on the masking tool, we just got linear gradients, the paint tool, and our radial gradients, our circular ones. In this case, now they've changed it. We've got this plus button right here, and we can add separate masks. And they work almost like layers, but they're just in effect separate masks. Okay, so we're clicking on this little plus button, and then we get some new options. The very first one says select subject. So what select subject and select sky, these two are both brand new artificial intelligence tools that we've got in Lightroom. So Lightroom will go and analyze your image, takes a few seconds, and then it will decide what it thinks is your subject or what it thinks is the sky in this image. So if you've got an image with sky, you can make Lightroom select the sky. You don't have to go and cut out all around the buildings and things. So this is very useful, and it's actually surprisingly accurate. So in most cases, it does a really good job of either finding your subject, finding your sky. Okay, in this case, I'm just going to press select subject. It's not something in a city skyline that I would really ever use, but we can start with select subject and just see what Lightroom thinks is our subject. Lightroom goes and analyzes the image, and it selects the building right in the center of the image. So Lightroom is telling me that it thinks this is my subject for my image, and I can then go and adjust the subject by itself without affecting the rest of the image. Okay. I'm going to roll that back and just cancel that, discard changes. What I want to start with in this case is my sky. So we're going to go again to the plus button. The second option there in all these options we get for our masking is select sky, and we're going to go select sky. Now again, Lightroom goes through and it decides what parts of this image is sky, and it will give me a mask of the sky. All these red, highlighted, reddish, pinkish, highlighted areas is what Lightroom thinks is part of the sky. And now it gives me all the normal, or a lot of the normal controls where I can adjust just the sky. So for instance, if I go to the light panel here on the right, while I'm in the masking, so you'll see my mask is selected here. It's showing my mask. It's showing the white part is the sky. And any adjustments I now do in my editing panel on this side will only apply to the sky. So we get most of our normal tools. There's a couple missing, but most of our normal tools will be on this side. And then it will only affect whatever we have masked off, which in this case is our sky. So I can drop the exposure in the sky if I wanted to. We can make it a bit darker. That's actually looking good. What we can also do is we can completely blow out the sky and make it all white. So this exposure slider is now only affecting the sky and not touching the buildings, which is quite useful. So we're going to make it, maybe we're actually, yeah, a little bit down, like a third down. Let's see. Third down in exposure, so 1/3 underexposed from what the actual image was taken at. That's looking good. I might increase the contrast in the clouds a little bit. That might help a little bit. Highlights we can drop a tiny bit just to get the white parts of the clouds to have more detail. You'll see there's a lot of detail in the actual clouds, in the white parts. Shadows, I'm not going to do anything with. Whites and blacks, I'm just going to leave right there for the sky. Okay. Now next we can go to color. We've got most of our color tools right here. So if we wanted to, we can increase the saturation of our sky, just get a bit more color in there. That's actually looking good. Just putting a bit more saturation in. We can also change the temperature of our sky. We can warm it up a tiny bit if we wanted to. We can also cool it down a tiny bit. So I think a little bit warmer than the original is actually looking good, because the bottom part of my sky is nice and orangey now. That's looking good. We can go to our effects. With clouds, I like my clouds to be fluffy and soft. So we might go minus in texture, minus a little bit in clarity. And I'm not going to touch the DAs. So what this does is it just makes my clouds a little bit softer. I don't like my clouds to be very crisp and over sharpened or over contrasty. So I think that works well. We can look at detail, and again we can drop our sharpness a tiny bit just to have those clouds again nice and soft. So the contrast in an image when it comes to sharpening, I think, is really important. When it comes to portraits, cityscapes, landscapes, a lot of these images, just having a sharp image doesn't always come across as being very sharp. But if you've got areas that are soft and areas that are sharp, those sharp areas look even more sharp because of the contrast to the other areas. So for instance, in a portrait, if the skin is soft, but the eyes are nice and sharp, the eyes look overly sharp. They look really sharp. And it's mostly because of the contrast between the skin being softer and the eyes being really sharp. And the same with images like this. If my clouds and my sky is nice and soft, then I know if I sharpen the building a tiny bit, it will look really sharp. Okay, so that's sort of what we're going for. Yeah, let me just check here. Everything is looking good. Great. Okay. So that's what we're going for. We're trying to build that sharpness contrast. If we sharpen everything in an image, doesn't look as good. And the parts that should be sharp doesn't look as sharp because now everything is sharp. So especially with digital cameras are so sharp, everything is really sharp. The lenses are good these days. That you don't really notice how sharp it is until you get some other areas that are softer. Okay, so that's what we're going for. Optics, we're not touching optics in this case. So that's our first adjustment, and it's just to the sky. Now what we're going to be doing is I'm going to click done. So what that does is it applies those adjustments I did to that mask, and my sky is now the way I want it. I'm going back to masking. I'm going to start another mask. So I pressed plus again. I'm going to again do select sky. So now I've got my second sky mask. It's going to go through, select pretty much the exact same mask we just had. But what I'm trying to do now is actually adjust the rest of the image. I'm going to adjust the buildings and the foreground separately from the sky. So without sharpening the sky, I can now do things like sharpen the buildings, for instance. Okay, how do we do that? Right here on the side, you'll see we've got that little button. So it's like a little square with a circle in it, and there's like, it's split up black and white in halves. That's the inverse button. So left bottom corner of my screen on my iPad, just above the little trash button. So the delete mask button is the bottom one, the little trash can. If I click the one just above it, it's our invert button. So what it's going to do is it's going to invert my mask. So everything that's not selected right now, it's going to select, and everything that's selected, which is the sky, it's going to unselect. So basically it's just going to flip this mask to the rest of the image. There we go. So I click the button. Now everything except the sky is actually masked off. So this is like really handy to get everything except our sky. If we don't want to be adjusting the sky, which is where we are right now, we can now do that. So you'll remember my sky, I actually dropped the exposure a tiny bit to get it a little bit more dark, a little bit more moody, and also to bring some of that details in the white clouds out, so that we can see some of the detail in the clouds. Now we're going to be doing sort of the opposite with the buildings. We want the buildings to be brighter. So the nice thing is we can go to exposure and we can actually brighten up our buildings a tiny bit. Okay. We can put a little bit of contrast into our buildings if we wanted to. Highlights, we can drop a tiny bit. I think shadows, we can open up a tiny bit just to get some more detail in these buildings. So already it's looking really good. I can see a lot more detail in these buildings. Color, I'm going to make it a little bit warmer. These buildings have got sort of the sunset was on the other side. You can see some of the reflection of the sunset there in those buildings. So I'm just warming it up a tiny bit just to get a little bit more of that sort of sunset reflection going. And I'm going to put a bit of saturation into those buildings as well, just to get a bit more color. So that orangey glow that they've got. Okay. Effects, I'm going to actually increase texture a tiny bit for my buildings because I want a bit more texture there. Buildings I want sharp, I want the texture, I want, yeah, exactly that. Different to what we just discussed with the clouds. I can put a tiny bit of clarity in. I don't want to overdo clarity. Clarity can have some strange effects, especially on the outsides of buildings, like where the building meets the sky. Clarity can do some funny things and do haloing, similar to what over sharpening does. So I'm just going to add a tiny bit of clarity. I added a bit of texture. DAs I'm not going to do. It wasn't a hazy day. There's no haze there. Everything is perfectly sharp. I'm happy with that. And what I am going to do is I'm just going to increase my sharpness also a tiny bit. So we get some sharpening, let's say around about there. So now we've got some sharpening also on the buildings. And I'm happy to sharpen buildings, not sharpen my sky, because that's the one place I really don't want to sharpen is my sky. Okay. And that pretty much does that for our local edits. I think that looks a lot better. What I can do if I really wanted to is I can just, the way bottom of the image, I can just darken up a tiny bit. It feels to me a little bit light. My eye wants to go to that middle building, but there's a couple of buildings right on the bottom edge that's just a little bit too white, too bright. That's a little bit distracting to me. So what we can do is add another mask. And we're going to add one of our mask that we know previously in Lightroom we already had, the linear gradient. And I'm just going to drag my Apple Pencil in this case, but you could do it with your finger on any touch device or with your mouse to editing on a laptop. So I'm just dragging it from the bottom and then letting it go sort of right there. So you can see I've got a mask that's fully masked right at the bottom. Then when it hits that first line, it starts to fade until it hits the second line, it fades more, and the top line is where there's no mask anymore. So you'll see that very top white line, nothing happens close to that line. So there's no more, whatever I'm adjusting is not going to be adjusted there. Everything below the bottom white line is going to have the full adjustment that I actually apply now. So I'm going to go to my light panel again, just going to drop my exposure a tiny bit just to get that bottom part a little darker. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to drop my highlights just to try and get those very bright buildings to not be as bright right on the bottom edge of this image. I think this is pretty much a good edit on what we're trying to do there. Okay. If there's any questions, again, just pop them in the chat. I'm happy to answer any questions. So that was our before image. And again, I'm just touching on the image or next to the image. They both do the same thing. On mobile devices, if you just hold your finger next to the image or on the image, it will show you the before. And that's our edited one. I think that looks pretty good. I'm very happy with that image. And we'll move on to the next one. Good. Again, city skyline, very similar to what we just had, and we're going to do a very similar thing. What we can actually do is copy our masks from the previous image over to the next image. I think that's probably a good thing to do, just to show you how it works in Lightroom. So different to Photoshop, it's very easy to apply the same masking and the same editing to multiple images, and that's why we use Lightroom, is to do batch editing. I'm going to quickly show you what it does right now, and also what I think Lightroom is going to be doing in future. So what I'm going to do is I'm pressing on this little 3 dots ellipsis sign on the top right corner, and I'm going to go to copy settings right here, and I'm just going to select masking. So now masking is the only thing that's selected, and we can also open up the masking. So there's a little arrow next to it, and it will show you what we're copying. So the very first one is just that part darkening the bottom. The second mask is our buildings. The third mask, it's called mask 1, is actually our sky mask. So that's the first one we created. And the bottom two has got little triangles next to it, just telling us that these are artificially intelligent masks. They actually analyze the image, and they will have to be recalculated for the next image, which is fine. We'll do that. So I'm going to select masks. We're going to our next image, very similar sort of image, and I'm going to paste those by pressing the ellipse in the corner, and I'm going to go paste settings. So now our masks are getting pasted into this image. Not much happened. Basically what happened now is 2 of our masks need to be recalculated, the sky one and the buildings one, and the other one that just darkens the bottom is now in, and it did a tiny bit of a change there. So we're going to our masking tools by pressing the mask button, and you'll see there's 2 masks at the bottom with little triangle warning signs on them. So we just click on these, and then we click update, and it will recalculate that mask. So because this is a calculated mask that the artificial intelligence did, it has to recalculate it. Now it's applied that one. So our sky is done. Now we have to do our buildings one, and I click update. I do nothing else, and it will now go and find everything that's not sky, recalculating that, and it will apply our edits to that. So as easy as that, we've applied the same edits that we had. Let me show you the 2 images. We did the edits here. From that image, we got this image. We copied those masks over to this one, and from, let me show you, large one, from this image, we got that image just by copying over those masks and having them recalculate. Okay. So very similar conditions, so I could just do it. What I can do if I need to is I can go back to any of these masks. So for instance, our sky mask, and I can go and adjust any of these settings. As you can see, it copied over the settings I had for the previous sky mask. What I can go and do now is I can adjust any of these further if I wanted to. For instance, if I think my building mask is now a little bit bright, I can go back and just darken up those buildings a tiny bit. And there we go. So we don't always have to start from scratch in Lightroom. We can copy our settings between images. And this is the only tool, these AI tools with the sky select or the subject select, it's the only tools where you actually have to ask it to recalculate, because it has to go and analyze that specific image. So if you copy it onto a new image, you need to ask it to recalculate. Any other settings in Lightroom, it will just copy and it will just work, no issues. I do expect Lightroom to probably in a future update make this automatic. So as you copy it in, it might automatically do the update. Okay. I've seen the feature being asked for in some of the Lightroom developer forums, and I'm hopeful that they might just implement it. So as you copy it in, it will recalculate. But right now they're thinking they'll copy it in, and then you just need to click the update button. Okay, so that's where we are with those. Let's go to another example. Okay, an image that we previously had before. There's a couple of issues with this image, but the details there. This is a raw image. We know the detail in the shadows is there, and previously we did some global adjustments to bring out the detail that we wanted. In this case, we're going to be doing masking adjustments to get back the detail we want. So first off, I'm going to click on masks again. I'm going to click the plus button again, and in this case, I'm going to go select subject. We let it calculate. Lightroom is going to do its best to try and find this subject for me. As you can see with the red mask, it's done a really good job of isolating the subject and just masking the subject and not getting the background. Okay, so that's already looking good. Now we can start our adjustments. I'm going to lift the exposure a tiny bit. Let me just do it slowly so I can see what I'm doing. About half a stop there. I'm going to lift the shadows as well, just to get some shadow detail back. And as you can see, we're getting some nice detail back in our subject's face, which is exactly what we want. We want his face to be properly exposed, properly lit. So what we're doing now, what we're adjusting now, is just the subject. We're not adjusting anything on the background. The background was fine. So this is actually a really nice thing to be able to do, is just adjust our subject. I think we're close. That looks like a good exposure on the subject. So we're going to press done on that one. Now that I've got a better idea of my image and what the subject looks like, I think I actually want a bit more light, especially around his eyes and his face, but I don't want to overexpose his shirt. So we're going to do masking again. I'm going to press the plus button again. And just to do a really quick mask that will give me some light on his face, I'm going to do radial gradient, which means it's a round or an oval shaped mask. I'm going to press down in the middle of his face and just drag to get a mask that will sort of cover his face. Okay. Now this mask will adjust the most, or it will have the most effect in the center of it, and it sort of fades towards the ends, towards the outsides. So basically, right there on the very edges of it, it's not going to be adjusting much. So even if it overlaps a tiny bit onto the background, it's not going to be doing much to the background. It's mainly focusing on the more interior area of that ellipse that we've got on there. Okay, so we go to light, we go a little bit up, and maybe a tiny bit up as well in the shadows. And as you can see, we're layering masks on top of each other. So the first one, we adjusted the whole subject. Now I've got the face. And what I actually want to do is I want to do another mask on top of this one. I'm going to go radial gradient again. And what I'm going to do is I'm just trying to get this eye area right there. I just want to get a tiny bit more light into his eyes. So by layering these masks, I can really hone down into the areas where there's a bit too much shadow or darkness and get some light right in those areas where I want to. So I'm putting a little bit of exposure, 1/3 in there, and I'm lightening the shadows again a tiny bit. And by doing that, now I can see his eyes nicely. Okay. So we've got detail back in his eyes. Looking at that, I've got detail back in his face. And previously, the before image, we could almost see nothing in there. There was no detail. It was all in the shadows. Luckily, it was a raw image, so the detail was there. We just couldn't see it. And by layering these three masks on top of each other, suddenly I've got eyes there, and I've got a good portrait because I can see his eyes. Okay. So that's really handy to be able to layer these masks on top of each other and work in this way. And also, Another reason why we did this layering is I didn't want his shirt to get too white and too bright. I wanted the detail to still be visible, the threads and the detail and the writing and everything on his shirt. So trying to preserve his shirt, we did 3 layers on his face to just lighten up firstly the whole person, then just the whole face, and then just the eyes. Okay, so I'm quite happy with this. Just to show you how we can play around with masks as well if we really wanted to. This is not something I would do, but just to show you the possibilities, I'm going to do another select subject. Just waiting for it to calculate. Now we've got the subject again. I'm happy with my subject, but what we could do is we could press the invert button in the bottom corner again. I'm going to invert this mask. Now we've just got the background. We can go to color and we can do funny things with the background if we wanted to. As you can see, I can actually make the background different colors. So this is another option that we've got. Because I can isolate my subject, I can actually also just invert it and then get an isolated mask for the background. So we can adjust the background by itself. So now we've got a completely different image to what we actually started with. But it just shows you the infinite possibilities when you're editing and you're using masking. Actually, actually really good. I'm just doing a quick crop just to finish off this image. That's sort of a good crop on this one because I want the writing on his pocket. It's a big part of this image. Okay. Next. This is Joburg Photowalkers visit to Roger Ballin's gallery or studio. And this is another Roger in the image, Roger Lee. You might recognize him there. So again, we're going to be using masking and we're just going to be improving this image. So first off, looking at this and also thinking back to the day when I was there with this light coming through, I actually definitely think this should be a black and white image. So before we do anything else, I'm going to swap it to Adobe Monochrome in my color profiles. So color profiles in your edit panel. If you click on your edit panel, you'll find it under profile, and I just click browse and I selected Adobe Monochrome. Okay. So already it's closer to the feeling that I wanted for this image. I actually quite like this look of it. So now, and what you need to be thinking of is when you're looking at an image, think about the mood, think about what the story was, what it felt like to be there. Think about all these things and then decide which direction you want to go with your edit. So in this case, I definitely want to go moody. I want to go black and white, and I want to enhance this feeling of this light coming from the top right of this image. So that's what we're going to try and do. We're going to try and just enhance this feel that we've already got there. Now I'm looking at my image, I'm seeing different things, and I'm trying to figure out how I can enhance it. First thing that I'm seeing is right here in this corner, there's a lot of detail in the ceiling. So I think it's sort of an unfinished ceiling. There's the aluminium framing is in there, but the actual ceiling boards aren't. So this is, to me, a bit distracting. There's a bit too much detail in this. So the very first thing we're going to be doing and solving is sorting that out with masking. I'm going to go linear gradient, and I'm just going to pull a linear gradient down from the top and put it in a spot where I think it will mostly cover that that distracting detail that I don't want. And a good way, especially in a black and white image, to reduce that is just to reduce the exposure in this case. So as we drop the exposure, it will be less obvious. It will sort of disappear into a bit of a shadow. Okay, so let's start moving that around. I'm not going to get rid of it completely. I just want it to be less distracting. I don't want my eye to go there. When I open up this image, when I look at this image, I don't want my eye to go directly to the ceiling. I want to enhance this beam of light coming down. So we can do another one of these. So we're just going to do a couple of these linear gradients. I'm going to put another one right here in the bottom. And I'm going to do a similar thing of dropping my exposure on this one. So I'm darkening down the ceiling, I'm darkening down this bottom part that's not really of interest to me. And then in a global edit, what I will do is I'll just push my contrast up. The contrast is going to make my bright areas brighter, my dark areas darker. So you'll see if I go to the left, there's a lot of detail in Roger's shirt there, a lot of detail on the wall. As I go to the right, you'll see this beam of light will be more white and brighter, and the darker areas or the more shadowy areas will start dropping down towards black. Okay, so that's what we want. We want that contrast. And I think that also enhances that beam of light coming in. It's now a lot more obvious. Because it was the sort of the brightest part of the image, we've pushed it even more bright, and the dark areas, the shadowy areas surrounding that beam of light are going more into shadow. Okay, and then the last thing I want to do is I just want to sharpen Roger right there a tiny bit. So we're going to go masking. I'm going to just use a brush tool. I'm just slightly brushing the edges, right along the edges, just to get a tiny bit of a mask there. I don't have to be exactly perfect, because what I'm going to be applying is sharpening. And sharpening will look for those edges inside my mask. So it will only sharpen edges. And we go to detail and we add some sharpening. So that will just sharpen the outside edges of our figure there. And that looks like a good image. I might just crop it in it. No, maybe not. I actually like all this black space in it. What we can do is add another mask, another linear gradient, and I just want to darken down. There's one bright part of light here, right on the left-hand side. And I'm going to drop the exposure on that again and drop my highlights on that again. Now, the only focus of this image that's left is this beam of light and Roger Lee with his cell phone taking an image right there in the center of it. So now I think the focus is exactly on the right place. So if we go back to the before and we look at our after, we've done some masking to hide some detail. We didn't remove it from the image, we just pushed it a little bit darker, a little bit more into the shadow, especially there on the ceiling. And this is a really nice image that we're left with. So being able to apply these masks to specific areas, being able to paint into specific areas to do a bit of sharpening, gives us a lot of options on enhancing the mood or the feel of an image. Okay. The main thing with edits like this is you need to have sort of an idea or a vision of what you want to do with the image before you even start. And then you just layer on these things to get to where you want to be. Okay. Next image. So portrait. So we've talked previously about eyes and eyes being sharp and skin being soft. So now we can put all that into practice. This is a good example of that. I'm going to just start off with a select subject. I want to brighten up my background a tiny bit. So it's just off white. I just want it to go completely white. So now we've got our subject. And as you can remember, we can also invert these masks by pressing the invert button, which we're doing right there. And Lightroom did a really good job of just giving me a selection of the background now. This artificial intelligence is getting really good, and with every update it's getting better. So definitely worth trying. So now we've got the background. I'm going to increase our exposure on the background just to get it nice and white. Okay, so we've done 2 1/3 stops over on the background, so that's a good place to be. Now I'm going to press the plus button again for a new mask, and we're going to do some adjustments to this image. Just broad strokes portrait adjustments like we might want to do. So now I've got my brush selected, and we're going to be making a new mask with the brush. I can just paint on the image wherever I want this. On the left hand side, you'll notice that we've got the brush tool here. We can select the size of it. Right there, I can adjust the size. You'll see it go larger and smaller. I'm just going to get a comfortable size to work with in this case for this portrait. You can also adjust things like the feather on your brush, the opacity on the brush. So if you don't want, if you want the background to come through your mask a little bit, you can do that. You can invert again. You can also, you'll see right here where I've got the brush little button, there's also an erase button. So if I brush in something that I don't want, I can go back and remove it again. So let me show you. So let's say we just want to get like skin on the face. I can start brushing in and I can just get a little bit of skin if we just want to do a bit of skin softening. Okay, so we just brushing over the skin in this case. And let's say I make a mistake, and let's say I get an eye as well in this case. I can just go back, select the eraser, and then go over eye again. We don't want to soften eyes or eyebrows. Also, we don't want to soften her mouth. And that's good enough. You don't have to be perfectly accurate when it comes to these masks. We will go to effects. I'm going to drop the texture a tiny bit just to get a bit smoother skin, a little bit less clarity, and in detail we can also drop the sharpness a bit. So that will just make the skin a little bit softer. Now to contrast that, we want to actually sharpen her eyes. Okay, so we're going to press the plus button again. We're going to get a new mask. We'll go to brush. We'll use the same size brush and we'll just brush over her eyes. Okay, now we've got her eyes selected. I'm just going to erase a tiny bit that I went over on the bottom. Now that we've got her eyes selected as masks, and you'll see the little picture on the mask, there's two little white dots on my mask image. So with that selected, I can then go to detail and I can sharpen her eyes a tiny bit. I can go to effects. I can put a tiny bit of clarity in, a tiny bit of texture in just to enhance her eyes a little bit. And we can go to color and saturate them a tiny bit as well. You don't want to go overboard with edits on eyes and things. It can very easily look artificial. So tiny adjustments will make a massive difference, especially if you contrast it. So if you go with the skin a little bit softer, the eyes a little bit sharper, that contrast between the two will really make her eyes stand out. I don't want to overly sharpen and move things way to the right on the sliders. I just want to do it like a little bit of adjustments to help with what we've already got there. Okay, so that's looking really good. Now the other thing that we can do, especially on black and white images, is we can do a tiny bit of dodging and burning, which means the areas we paint on, we want to make go darker or lighter. Okay, we can do a very similar thing even on a color image. We can do a tiny bit of dodging and burning. In this case, I'm just going to show you on her hair just to enhance the effect. Going back to masking, I'm going to do a new mask. I'm going to go brush again. Now what I'm looking for is I'm looking for darker areas in her hair that I can actually drop a tiny bit more in exposure. And then I'm going to do another mask, go for lighter areas in her hair and just brighten those up to again create some contrast between dark and light. And it's what's already there that I'm trying to enhance. So as you can see right here in the top, we've got a darker area in her hair. I'm going to just paint over that lightly, paint over this darker area lightly, this maybe as well. So I'm just trying to find darker areas in her hair. I've selected a couple there, just lightly painted on there, and I'm just slightly going to drop the exposure on those areas, not much. Okay, now we're going to do another mask doing a similar thing, brush. Now I'm going to go for the lighter streaks. I'm just going to paint over anywhere where I see lighter streaks in her hair. You'll see me go to places where there's bits of lighter streaks, and I'm going to just up the exposure a tiny bit. You'll see that just created some extra contrast right there in her hair, like from the before to the after. You need to look closely to see the difference, but it actually looks quite nice when you're doing these little dodge and burn. So you're darkening dark areas, lightening up bright areas. If you want to go further, even with dodge and burn on a portrait, what you can also do is we can look at the shape of her face, enhance that a tiny little, just get a little bit of more light shape in there. That we also can do with light modifiers when we're actually taking this image. but I'm going to just show you with a brush. So we've got our same brush there. I'm just going to drop the size a tiny bit, and right below it, cheekbones, right there where we would expect a shadow to fall, I'm just going to paint in there. So if my light was a little bit higher up, I would have gotten a little bit of a shadow right below her cheeks, and that's always a nice little like darker area to get in a portrait. And I'm going to light, and I'm just going to darken it a tiny bit. So that just like shapes the cheeks a tiny little bit. I mean, it doesn't do anything that wasn't there. I'm just enhancing the light that was falling right there, and that little bit of a shadow. Okay, so especially on portraits, on things like landscapes and cityscapes, you can probably adjust a bit more, and you can go a bit further with things like sharpening and dodging and burning. On a portrait, especially a color portrait, you want to do small adjustments to not make it look artificial. On a black and white portrait, you can go a little bit further to enhance the mood and the shadows and the light. Because a high contrast black and white can still work. On color, you have to be really subtle with your changes. So just for you to see, that's the original image. Let me just get the image. So that's the original image, and that's our edit. It just gives a little bit more mood, a little bit more shape, and we've sharpened up the eyes, softened the skin a tiny bit. Okay. So next image. I think this is our last one. This is a panorama. While we're at the pano right here, next week we will be looking at panoramas and putting them together. So if you're taking a lot of images, like I did in this case, I took a lot of separate images, whether it's in one row or two rows. You can take a lot of images like zoomed in to get a lot of detail. And what Lightroom can do is it can stitch it together for you. So you might be taking 20 megapixel images, and you've got 10 of them, and they make up a bigger image. Lightroom can put them together for you, and you've got, let's say, a 100 megapixel image left, or an 80 megapixel image left, because there might be some overlap, or there should be some overlap. So it's built into Lightroom now. Lightroom can do it. Previously, again, this was something that we had to go to Photoshop for. We can do our panorama stitching inside of Lightroom. And what we can also do is we can do HDR, so high dynamic range. You can underexpose an image, get a perfect exposure, and overexposure, expose the same one again. Lightroom will put them together, will give you the best exposed areas from each of the three images once it's put it together. So we'll see what it does, what that effect is. If you've never done high dynamic range or HDR photography before, might be an interesting session to see. Also, if you've never done stitched panoramas where you're putting a lot of images together to get a very high resolution file, that might be interesting as well next week. So this file is, let's just see, stitched together. It is, where's the size? 408 megapixels. So we've got a 408 megapixel file here, which is quite nice. It's lots and lots of little images that was all stitched together to get this high res image. My camera can definitely not do 400 megapixels. Okay, we're going to masking again. Last example, very quickly. We're going to go select sky. Almost done. We've got the sky selected. I'm going to go to light. I'm going to just play around with my exposure a tiny bit in the sky, a little bit of contrast, maybe make the highlights less bright to get some detail in the clouds. We can add a little bit of warmth into the sky there. Going to put a bit of saturation into it as well. That's already looking like a nice sky. I'm quite liking the tones of the colors of it. Detail, I'm going to drop the sharpness again. I never want to sharpen sky. Can drop the texture a tiny bit and the clarity a tiny bit, and then I'm happy with the sky. So now we're going to do the opposite again. So we wanted to do select sky. It's going to pick out the sky for us. There we go. I'm going to invert it, bottom left hand corner on my device. Now we've got everything except the sky selected. And in this case, we're going to go back to light. We're going to just open up and give some contrast to that foreground. I'm wondering if this is the way I want to go though. So we've got two options. I can either open up the shadows and get some detail in that foreground, or I can go the opposite way and make that whole foreground go dark and have more of a silhouette image, which is definitely a good way to go in this case. So you can see if I drop my exposure, I can get a real skyline silhouette right there. It's actually looking quite nice. So that's the other option. Because I can leave my sky by using this masking, I can leave my sky intact, just drop the exposure on whatever is below the sky. Actually makes for an interesting image. We might just go with that. Maybe not completely gone with all the detail, but right there. And then we'll do some sharpening, because on the buildings in the bottom, on the outlines of the buildings, I think sharpening is applicable. Maybe a tiny bit of clarity as well, just for the outlines. But I think that's probably a good edit. So that's the nice thing with being able to mask sky separate from the rest of the image, is I can leave my sky where I think it's got a good exposure and drop the exposure on whatever is below it to get this nice silhouette-y, like a skyline like this. I think that's actually quite nice. What I can do on that last mask where we were selecting this bottom part of the image is I can also go back and just drop my highlights, because there's a couple of lights, some street lights or advertising lights or things in the bottom part of the image that made little white dots. So I dropped that as well. And what we can also in detail do to get rid of those, even though they were real lights, like little street lights or building lights or something, they made little dots on this dark part at the bottom. So if I do some noise reduction, some of them will start to disappear, because noise will look very similar to these little dots. Sometimes you've got some dust on something, so you maybe did a product photo of something and there's just a few flecks of dust on it. You can go in and healing tool and each one of those remove it, or very often you can actually just mask that part of the image and do noise reduction just on that part, and it will take those little pinpricks of dust away and give you a nice smooth surface. It's just a faster way than going in and removing each one of those little white dots. So that's something to remember. Sometimes noise reduction is not only for noise, but whatever little dots you've got on something. Okay, there we go. I think that's where we're going to leave that image. It's a little bit skew, so the last thing I'm going to do is just straighten it a tiny bit. That looks better. Now we've got a straighter building there, straighter Ponte and a straighter Hillbrow or Telkom Tower. I think that looks good. If there's any questions, I'll stick around for a couple of seconds just to see if I can answer any of your questions. But yeah, I'll encourage you, if you haven't tried the masking tools in Lightroom, they're getting really good, and by the day they're getting better. So it gives us so much new possibilities now, and you can copy this edit to the next image, which is great, which is harder to do in something like Photoshop, for instance. So the Lightroom tools that we're getting is so powerful now. But I'm glad you joined. I'm still giving it a couple of seconds for questions. Otherwise, we're going to call it a night. I hope you learned something new. I hope it was interesting. See if there's any questions. Good. Thanks again, Sonia. Thanks for joining again. Glad you enjoyed it. Great if you get value from it. I definitely do. Just playing around with these tools, researching for every episode. Like, I learn new things every time before I'm presenting, and I thought I knew all these things, but every single week I learn some new things when I try around these tools. There's one little other thing that was also added now in the masking. We're not going to do it now because it's not very applicable to most of the work that I've seen, cityscapes, portraits. I don't really use it, but just so that you know it's there, as you do add new mask, right at the bottom, we've got two new tools there that says color range and luminance range. There's also a depth range, but that only is applicable to iPhone photos where it used the LiDAR to get depth of an image. So if you're taking photos with a normal camera, you'll never see that option available. It's like grayed out, that last depth range, where you can filter things based on depth. Like I said, that's really only applicable to some of the very new iPhones. But we have got color range and luminance range. So you can actually mask based on how bright something is or how dark something is if you use luminance range, or you can also mask by color. So you can select a color in your image and it will mask all the areas with a similar color. So if you just want to be editing the red areas or the blue areas, or just want to be editing something that's very bright or something that's very dark, you can use those masks as well. I haven't found it really useful at all. In most cases, the top options that we've got in this list will cover any needs that I've got. But just so that you know, maybe once in a while you get something where you need to edit all the orange areas or something in an image, and you can go and then just go color range, select an orange part, and it will select all the similar ones in your image, so that you know. Great. I see some more people saying they learned something. Great stuff. I'm glad you learned something. And again, you're welcome to ask questions also in the WhatsApp group through the week. I'm super happy that you all joined. I'm really enjoying these sessions. Great stuff. Then we're going to call it for tonight, and I'll see you next week. Cheers, everyone. Have a good evening.